Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. We're so pleased to have you here with us for today's lecture, Klezmer and Other Displaced Musics in America, with scholar and performer Walter Zev Feldman. This lecture is co-sponsored by the American Society for Jewish Music's Jewish Music Forum, and it is a part of Carnegie Hall's festival, United in Sound, America at 250. It's a part of our celebration of the Jewish impact on American music, part of Carnegie Hall's broader celebration of American music at the 250th anniversary of the country. And we're so pleased to have you all with us for this today. Just a brief word about YIVO. We're a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. At the core of YIVO is our archive and library, which consists of over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from around the world. We bring to life the world of these collections through public programs like this, through classes and through exhibitions. And we're just delighted to spend an afternoon together exploring Klezmer in America with you today. Walter Zev Feldman is a leading researcher in Ottoman Turkish and Jewish music, instrumental in the 1970s Klezmer Revival. His notable works include Klezmer Music, History and Memory from 2016, and Music of the Ottoman Court, Makam, Composition, and the Early Ottoman Instrumental Repertoire, which is from 1996 and revised in 2024. Feldman has extensively studied the instrumental traditions of Moldova's Klezmer and lautar communities, and he is the academic director of the Klezmer Institute. Zev, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here, even virtually, yes. So maybe we could have a shot of the book. Hello? Yep. There we are. Okay, so this is my newest publication. It's the first time I've published a kind of memoir. Yes. Okay, we don't need the picture. That's it. Thank you. Okay, so this is a musical memoir that treats the 1960s, 1970s. So I was a very young creature at that time. And I'm talking about musical interactions, which were pretty much on the periphery of New York society. I was born in the Bronx in 1949, and most of the stories that take place are with musicians in Manhattan, in Queens, sometimes in Brooklyn. And it's also talking about music on several artistic levels. So the highest level musicians I knew at the time were two recent immigrants, one from Iran and the other from Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I talk about Nasser Rastegar, the santur player, and you see on the cover of the book I'm playing his instrument, his Persian santur. And then Anshunik Arustamian, who was a very great virtuoso of the bowed kamancha. And he had played for Stalin, he had played for the Shah of Iran, and it turned out that he actually knew some of Moshe Beregovsky's musicians in Kiev, because he studied at the Kharkov Conservatory in Ukraine. And he, in the 70s, he showed me things about what the Beregovsky's musicians were playing back in the 1930s. And I only discovered who Moshe Beregovsky was a few years later, precisely at the YIVO, where I discovered his article, Jüdische Instrumentale Volksmusik, published in 1937 in Yiddish, and which I eventually translated the term Klezmerische Musik of Moshe Beregovsky, translated into English as klezmer music. And that's how the term became used in the English language. When I first used it in the mid-70s, nobody understood what it was. So, the book has a focus that goes from my early life, from the shuls, from the synagogues in the Bronx, to both the Ashkenazi shuls and the Turkish Sephardi synagogue, of which I was a member. Then going into other ethnic communities, mainly Greeks and Armenians. And the focus of the talk I have here will be about two themes. One really talking about Greek musicians, both of the older generation of immigrants and the Greek Americans. And if you read the book carefully, you'll see that the Greeks were very, very important in reestablishing klezmer music in America. And I think in the book, since it's a memoir and not a musicological study, I don't emphasize that sufficiently, so I want to emphasize it here. Now, let's see, yes, and the other theme really has to do with the role of Moldova, Bessarabia, and where my father had emigrated in 1920, from where he had emigrated, in the creation of a kind of synthesis of Ashkenazi klezmer music with the lautar, Moldavian gypsy music, and Greek music, which took place over a period of many generations since the time the Ottoman Turks were ruling Moldova. And that's a very important theme, and I was able to do research on that myself, but many years later. So the book itself the book that goes up into the 1980s is not going to be able to talk about that, because I only was able to do this research after 2000. But I'll talk about it a bit today. By the way, the National Yiddish Book Center has an interview with me that was done last year with Hank Wisniewski, which discusses some of these themes as well. So you can find that on the website of National Yiddish Book Center. Okay, so as I mentioned, the title of the book, first of all, is From the Bronx to the Bosphorus. Now, I'm from the Bronx, and the Bosphorus is, of course, the body of water separating Asia and Europe in Constantinople, Istanbul. And I use that title because since my teenage years, I was aware of this connection somehow with Istanbul and with people, both Greek, Turkish, Sephardic, coming from that area. And even my father, Zev Feldman, he told me when I was a child, I remember that our country first had been Turkey. And many years later, I realized that our family, my father's family, had emigrated there, probably in the 18th century, when the Ottoman Turks were still ruling the country. That's an important theme. And I'm going to quote a couple of things from the book, because, again, one of my themes is that Greeks were absolutely crucial in helping me to focus on, in a sense, my own tradition. And I mentioned, first of all, the Chicago-born Greco-Albanian Pyrrhus Ruchas, whom I met in 1964, who became a musical and ethnographic mentor. As a journalist and an amateur musician, Pyrrhus imparted an understanding of the complexities of ethnic identity in a way that was not surpassed even by my later graduate studies at Columbia University. So I was very fortunate to know him. Now the important point is that the klezmer, as a functioning musician, I was born in '49, so by the time I was coming of age in the 50s, 60s, it barely had a presence anymore. The one institution which preserved the klezmer functionally was the Lansmanshaftn, the regional associations of the immigrants. And my father was a member of the Jedinets Lansmanshaftn of our shtetl, in an important Jewish town in the north of Moldova, which was then near the fortress Khotin. It was still in the fortress Khotin, except the fortress Khotin is now in what's Ukraine, and then it was Romania, before that in the Russian Empire, before that Turkish Empire. So, this presence, let's say, my father was aware of this, and but there were no young people. There was none of my peers. For example, since the immigration was largely restricted after 1924, most of my peers had grandparents who immigrated from Eastern Europe, not parents, so they were not active in the Landsmannschaft. Or my peers were the children of Holocaust survivors, who came more recently, and of course they were not active in Landsmannschaft. So the Lansmanshaftn often would hire musicians that they knew, and when I was a child, I was taken to the Jedinets Lansmanshaftn. It happens my father, Zev Feldman, was a very good dancer, so I could see him dance. And one of the musicians who we all knew about was Dave Tarras, a great clarinetist from Ukraine. And as I found out, he had actually studied in my father's shtetl, in Jedinets. which was a great center of this music. So let's show a picture, first of all, of my father, Zev Feldman, in Yedenis, taken in 1934 when he was visiting. Yeah, there you see him with some friends, I think none of whom survived the Shoah. But my father's in the center. And we were from a family of furriers, and he had actually a lot of very positive things to say, both about the town and about the interactions with the non-Jewish people. He made a point of telling me that not to blame our neighbors for what happened to his relatives, because it was not the fault of the neighbors. Relations were actually very good. So, so the absence of Klezmer, okay. When I go back to my mentor, Pyrrhus, I met him at one of the nightclubs. Okay, we can remove the photo now, Julia. Okay, wait 1 second. We're not yet at Tarras. Yes. So I met Pyrrhus Richis at one of the Middle East nightclubs, and we had a friend named Laszlo, who was a very good drummer. And at one point, Pyrrhus asked, "Is anyone playing freilachs at the clubs these days?" And Laszlo answered, "Oh, Jewish music. Sometimes I see an old man with a clarinet. It's nice music, something like Greek chasapiko. But nobody young seems to be playing it. Everybody is over 60. So that's the first reality. So how to overcome this? Basically, I needed to make contact with people who had a living tradition, and the Greeks actually did. So let's see now. So yeah, again, those who came from klezmer families like Hank Kosnetsky or Rachel Lemish in Philadelphia, they would have access to knowledge about the music. But most of the rest of us of my generation, there were some old recordings, but there was not much way to have this direct contact. So we'll take a picture of, we have a picture of Dave Tarras. Yes. Yeah. Now, Dave Tarras was still active. By the 60s, 70s, he was, well, not so much 70s, but in the 50s, 60s, he was still active. He was recording, a great artist, and I'll talk a bit more about him. And my family knew about him. He was a household name for us, both because of his fame in general and because there was this connection with my father shtetl, with Yedenitz. He had actually composed a piece for the Yedinitzer Bulgar for the Yedinitzers. Okay, now about Moldova, say a word. My friend Pyrrhus, or my mentor, when I first met him, I asked him, "Hello, are you Greek?" He said, "Well, yes and no. We go to the Greek church, but at home we speak Albanian." And he asked me, "Was your father born here?" "Well, no, he was from Bessarabia. It used to be Romania, but I don't think it is anymore." He said, "Oh, yes, Bessarabia. That's also called Moldavia. There are, or rather there were, many Greeks and Albanians living there. I've always liked the Jewish music from Bessarabia. It's the same time Jewish, Moldavian, and Greek." So, and this was a mystery. And he went on to tell me that he invited me to his house, to his home in Queens, and he said that many Greek clarinetists in New York used to listen to this Jewish music, and some of them, such as the Macedonian Costa Gadinis, actually recorded Jewish tunes. He didn't use the word klezmer, but these were klezmer tunes, and was influenced by a Jewish style of playing. Now, it turns out that in the 60s, I got to know a very great violinist, Nikita Chobanidis, from one of the one of the formerly Turkish Greek islands, and he revealed to me that he had played weddings with a musician called Naftali. It was Naftali Brandwein, famous klezmer clarinetist. And Nikita said, yes, that he used to play with Naftali at Romanian Jewish weddings. And he said the Romanian Jews really like Greek music. So this was a two-way street because my father actually really liked Greek music as well. So so I was aware of this since I was a teenager. Let's play a piece recorded in 1927 by this very same clarinetist, Costa Gadinis, who was from Macedonia. This was recorded in New York in 1927. He called it Roumanico Hasapiko. And Romanico, of course, is a code word for Jewish, in fact. But he couldn't call it Jewish because, his audience would probably think that would be something Ladino, Sephardic, so it was Romanico, Romanian. So let's play a little bit of this tune. Okay, thank you. Great, great. Now, Gaudinis was one of the most respected Greek clarinetists who emigrated to America, and some of you may recognize this tune as a klezmer tune. It was recorded first by the Belf Orchestra in Ukraine before the First War, and then in New York by the Abe Schwartz Orchestra in the same year that Gaudinis recorded it. But Gaudinis is playing it as a chasapiko. It's twice as fast, pretty much, as the Jewish versions. Jewish version, more or less, would be da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da. Now, Gaudinis evidently knew what he was doing. He did a masterful version of this as the Greek dance chasapiko, but it's note for note the same as the Jewish versions. 10 years later, and actually 1938, it happens that Romanian sociologists in northern Moldova did a documentation of a Greek Orthodox priest named Kyriak who played the same tune at Christian wedding. But his version is already Romanianized. It's simpler and different than any of these versions, but it's coming from the same melody. And this is before the Shoah. This is 1938, and I published an article, I wrote an article which was published in Romania called "Klezmer Tunes for the Christian Bride." And thanks also to my colleague in Chisinau, Vasile Chisenitsa. The Christians in Moldova had been playing these Jewish tunes for many generations. That is what I call a transitional repertoire. There was a repertoire of Moldavian genres played by the Jews, but which was already Judaized in style, and the Moldavians were playing Jewish tunes in a Moldavian style. And this Greek Orthodox priest in Moldova was a good example. He named the genre of the tune, he named Chosid. Chosid was the general term for these Jewish tunes, were played for listening, not so much for dancing. So this is all the same family of tunes. Now, in other parts of Europe, you didn't have this phenomenon, where Christians were playing Jewish music at Christian weddings. This was a very unique thing. So what was going on in Moldova? And this took me many years to figure out. Part of this, by the way, part of the mystery was that all the governments involved wanted to bury this history. Nobody wanted to know from it. And when I was a grad student at Columbia in the 70s, I was asked to participate in a seminar about, well, I was part of a seminar about the Western Soviet Union. I was responsible for Moldova because I can read Romanian and I can read Russian. So I read sources and I got some inkling of what was going on. And then I was asked to interview a Jewish woman from Moscow who is now in New York, and she had worked for Radio Moscow. So we met at the New York Public Library, and I remember we had a very interesting conversation, and she said to me, you know, well, in Moscow, when we had to play music from Moldova, there was a problem. I said, what was the problem? Well, the Russians thought it sounded too Jewish. It couldn't be really Moldovan. Now, this was a question, and it took me many years to get to the bottom of it. But in fact, the communist government in the 70s already in Moldova were trying to eliminate this mixed music, this Jewish-sounding music of the Moldovans. Now, part of the background, it took me a long time to figure out some of the history behind this. And again, I repeat, all the national governments were trying to forget about this history. It was an embarrassment. And actually, one of my mentors in this history was my teacher and friend, Rifat Abul Hajj, who was actually an Arab from Jerusalem, great expert in Ottoman history. And he always emphasized this 18th century, what he called the local modernity of the Ottoman 18th century. And part of the background was that after 1711, the Ottoman Turks removed the native princes from Moldova, Wallachia, and they put in Greek princes from Istanbul. And the first thing the Greeks did was to try to encourage the immigration of Greeks and Jews to develop the economy. And among the Jewish immigrants were the Klezmorim, were the professional musicians. When they got to Moldova, they discovered that, well, the Roma gypsies were slaves. And in Moldova, the gypsies had been slaves for 400 years, just as the Africans were in America. The best job you could get as a Roma slave was to be a musician, more called lautar. And apparently, the Roma found this entry of free Jewish musicians, a great opportunity, and they began teaming up with the Jews. And for the Turks, they allowed people of all religions to be in the same guild. So the gypsies found themselves playing with Jews and Greeks and Turks. And this is a long history. So what I write here in the introduction is that these unique social conditions in Moldova for 3 centuries have given rise to a musical symbiosis linking Ashkenazi Jews, local Roma gypsies, Moldavians, Turks, Crimean Tatars, and Greeks. This was a large part of the klezmer music that was brought to America 140 years ago. It formed the vanguard of the Klezmer revitalization that I helped to create a century later. And memories of this musical fusion survived among the older Greek and some Armenian musicians. So that is a part of the background. So when I formed my band Harissa many years later, I think I should go back and just say, okay, sorry. In the 70s, I got to know Andy Statman, and together, he was studying with several Greek musicians at the time. We played together in a Greek band called Palio Parea, and the Greek audience was really enthusiastic about klezmer music, about Jewish music. And in fact, even earlier, when I was playing in the Greek-American band Leventiko Pende, in the 60s, we were playing at a Greek hotel in the Catskills. And when I entered the dining room, all the Greek men and women got up, pointed at me, and said, "Dave Tarras, we love Dave Tarras." And then some members of the band lent me a couple of LPs that had Dave Tarras's music issued in Greek for a Greek audience. I played these for my father, but back home, and I said, of course, this is Dave Tarras, but it's all written in Greek. And some years later, I discovered that Tarras, at that point, Tarras's producer was a man named Tetos Dimitriadis, who was a Greek from Istanbul, then living in New Jersey. And he issued Tarras's music in separate editions for Jews in Yiddish and editions for Greeks in Greek. And thus far, I know of nobody doing discography who has actually analyzed and researched the Greek editions of Dave Tarras. So then moving ahead, when Andy Statman and I began to work with Tarras, to study with him, and then my friend Ethel Rame from the Center for Traditional Music and Dance got us an NEA grant to put Tarras back on stage. And in '78 we had this wonderful Dave Tarras concert of Jewish Klezmer music. Let's have a photo of us with Tarras at home, please. Yes, you see the bearded fellow is Andy Statman, the mustachioed guy is me, and that's Ethel Rame holding the shoulders of Dave Tarras. This was after the concert, already in the early '80s, I believe. And it was, of course, an enormously successful concert. Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, so let's go a little bit with both Tarras and the tradition that he brought through Moldova to New York. And something I'll say that some years later, when I formed my own band, Chevrisa, with Steve Greenman, we were playing in Cleveland, where he is from, and we announced that among the tunes we'll be playing, there were some coming from the town Jedenec in Moldova. A hand shot up in the audience, and the young man said, "I'm from Jedenec." Oh, so we all went out to dinner afterwards, and we had a wonderful conversation. And among the things he told me, we stayed in touch for years afterwards. One of the things he told me, he was a non-Jewish guy, he was a Moldovan, and he said, well, you know, we think like Jews, we do business like Jews, and to the South Moldovans, we are Jews. Now, how about that? So this gave me a lot of food for thought. And finally, in 2008, with my friend Alan Byrne, he had a grant from the European Union to find some place where klezmer and gypsy musicians still had some kind of interaction. And we decided the only place to look for this really was in Moldova. So we went together with a group of gypsy musicians from various places and some klezmer and neo-klezmer American musicians and Europeans. And we went to Chisinau and to our shtetl, to my shtetl, Jedenec. And when I got there, by the way, a Moldavian woman had a garden. And of course, it's a beautiful town, even now. And she had a garden, and she took some apples. When she heard that my father had come from Jedenec, she went up to me, gave me a few apples, and said, "Welcome home." And on the strength of that, some years later, I wanted to do further research. So while I was teaching in Abu Dhabi between 2010 and 15, we got research funds to go back to Moldova and to do serious field work. I work with my friend and partner, Christina Crowther. And by the way, there's a picture of me that Christina took in Jedenec in 2013 of the house. Yes. This is a house looks remarkably like the house that's in the photo with my father from 1934. And in fact, the town has not changed that much physically. It was always a rather prosperous town and a very good-looking little town. It's before the Shoah was predominantly Jewish, perhaps 80% Jewish. And although, of course, there were others, Moldavians, even Turks and Greeks. And by the way, one of the most beautiful descriptions of the shtetl is a memoir called Mein Shtetl Jedenec, which you have at the library there in Yivo, which was written by, what's her name? Ooh, I'm blanking. She published this in Argentina in the 40s. Gitman Krimmer, beautifully written book, Mein Shtetl Jedenec. And she was, by the way, a daughter of the Turkish baker, Mehmet, who spoke Yiddish like a Jew. So, and my father had gotten bread from Mehmet. He said that was the best bread in Yadinets. So now let me give you some examples of the music that came along with this culture. And I want to stress that Klezmer music was a unified musical culture that had been going on for about 400 years, originating in Prague among the Jews, where the guild Klezmer was first created and named. And Jews shared a basic core repertoire both for wedding rituals and for dance, wherever Yiddish was spoken in Eastern Europe. And of course, the Ashkenazi Klezmorim, coming from Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century into Turkish Moldova, brought this repertoire. But what happened that they found a very congenial culture, that both the Jews and the musicians, they could all relate to each other. And you had this, I mentioned, this interethnic communication going on there, which was really quite unusual. So let me give you a couple of musical examples. Let's see now. The first will be a recording from the 1950s that Dave Tarras did, which we had at home. I knew this recording. He gave it a title that is meaningless, Lomer Freilachstein, let's be happy. But I knew that this was a dance called Hangu or Honga. My father used to dance this, and then when I knew Dave, he showed me how he would dance it. And this is a Honga. Let's hear his beautiful recording that he did in the 50s. Thank you. So again, this is the kind of music that I was hearing at the Lansmanshaftn when I was a kid, and saw my father dancing. And now, when many years passed, no one was playing this music anymore. Andy Statman and I produced Dave's last recording, Music for the Traditional Jewish Wedding, and indeed he had one Hangu, a Honga tune, and it was a pleasure to dance around his apartment in Coney Island to this tune. Then flash forward ahead to 2008. There I was in Yadinets. Again, this is, by now, were only a handful of Jews left. And I met them, but there's only a handful of Jews left in Yadinets. But the memory of the Jewish presence was very strong, and it was no secret. When I would pass through the Jewish houses, the town was predominantly Jewish, people would point out to me that, oh, that was Friedman's house, and that was Lutzky's house, and people remembered who the Jews had been. And the band was led by a man named Vanya Popov, and there was also with his partner Anatoly Chobano, who since passed away. And let's take a picture we have a picture of the three of us at the end. With Vanya and me, and that's right, yes. That's Vanya on the left, that's me in the middle, and that's Tolia Chobano. Now, they're lautar. This band is still functioning, even though unfortunately, without Tolia. Vanya is a man of partly Ukrainian, partly Moldavian, partly Gypsy, partly Jewish descent. He has relatives in Israel. And they were the masters of this partly Judaized style, and which the Soviet government didn't like, but people still used to like it there. And in 2008, I asked them, do you have could you play me a Hangu? That's the Romanian pronunciation, is Hangu from here. And let's hear how they played the Hangu. Hangu from Yedinets. Can they play a Hangu from here?
Puteți cântați Hangu de aici?
Din aici? Din aici? By the way, just to be clear, this is Romanian, it's called Hangu, and Hung is an old Persian loanword in Romanian, in Turkish, in Hungarian. It has various meanings, but in Romanian it means a harmony and a line, things that are harmonious. So it's a dance of one person following the other and improvising. We do different improvising steps with our feet, and of course the Jews, we have our own way of dancing it, whether slow with our shoulders. And my friend Diana Bunia, the musicologist in Chisinau, she made me a tape of different recordings of Hangu from different towns, some of it more Jewish, less Jewish. And of course, this tempo for Hangu is the Jewish tempo. As you hear, what Dave Tarras recorded in New York in the 50s and what I recorded from them in 2008, very much the same tempo. In other towns where there were fewer Jews, the tempo is twice as fast, and it's considered a dance for young men. And once I taught this dance with Michael Alpert out in Weimar, in Yiddish Summer Weimar, with a Moldavian dance teacher, and the Moldavian looked at the two of us and he said, "Gee, you dance like old men. It's Batrinaska." Batrin is an old man in Romanian. So from the gentle point of view, our dancing is like old men would dance. But in a town like Yedinets, where it was predominantly Jewish, that became the style. And if you were from there, whether you were Jewish, Christian, Muslim, that's how you danced. So now I want to oh yes, I wanted to mention one thing. When I first met Vanya and the band in 2008, Vanya introduced himself in Romanian as Noi Klezmer, we Klezmer. Right? And he understood some Yiddish. Tolia studied even more Yiddish because when they were young men, they had played at Jewish weddings with their parents. Their fathers were famous lautar musicians, but they often called themselves Klezmer. And indeed, he's part Jewish. So, and they certainly don't call themselves Roma. They don't want to be called Roma. They'd rather be called either Tzigan or Klezmer. Now, the last example I have is from Dave Tarras. It's a bit earlier, actually, it's from the 40s, and it shows you the creativity of Tarras. He learned these tunes in Moldova, came to New York. Sometimes he recorded them the way he learned them. Other times he began to recompose and do new tunes based on these tunes, mixing elements from more core Jewish dance music with the Moldavian elements. I call this his hybrid style. was enormously popular and successful in New York, and it came in some ways to define this period of American klezmer music. So this is a tune that Tarras recorded in the 40s called Hebrew Dance, but it's his version, his modification of the Yedinitz Hangu. Hebrew Dance. Thank you. Cool. So I think that's a good way to end for now. And I just want to say that I'll be teaching this subject in more depth for a course for the 92nd Street Y starting this week, starting Wednesday for the next 4 weeks, which will be about the interaction of klezmer and Ottoman and Greek music. So I'm here to answer a few questions.
Thank you so much, Zev. This has been really fascinating. All right, we've got some questions in the audience, and I'll just take a moment to say, if you are out in the audience and you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So, Zev, you spoke about how it was this unique synthesis of music, of klezmer music, with other traditions that happened in Moldova that was brought to America, and that was the kind of seed of this Klezmer revival. How did that music differ from other forms of klezmer in other parts of Eastern Europe?
Well, let's say this is part of what I'll be talking about for the 92nd Street Y. There's a long, again, the klezmer music, and as I wrote in my book 10 years ago, it has four main stocks and components. One is coming from the Nusach Tefillah, from the Jewish prayer, that the Jewish dance tunes and the wedding tunes as well, the non-dance tunes, had a connection with the Jewish Nusach, with davening. Other element is coming from Baroque and Renaissance dance music. The Ashkenazi Jews were always still aware of the 17th, 18th century Central and West European dance music. The Sher is an 18th century contra dance that the Jews learned somehow from in Central Europe, ultimately of German origin. The other component was coming from Ottoman Turkish music, that the Jews, Klezmorim, had been playing Turkish, especially Turkish military music, since the 18th century. They were playing it for the Gentile aristocracy in several countries, in Bohemia and in Poland, and they were playing it for the Jews. So this was throughout Eastern Europe. We even have a document from Berlin from the 1790s of a cantor from Berlin, played violin. He's playing Yiddish Turkish melodies, but based on the military music, very complex music. So that was universal. Now, when this synthesis began to happen in Moldova in the 18th century between the Greeks, the Gypsies, the Ashkenazim, the Jews everywhere liked it. I even interviewed in Jerusalem a Jewish musician from Vilna who said, yes, the Jews love this music, that whenever they grabbed it up. And in fact, in Vilna, the Litvaks, of course, had their own tradition, which had all these components, including the Turkish component. But the Romanian component, let's say the mixture of Greek, Romanian, Yiddish, that was exotic. That was coming from Moldova. And what we see is that when the Jews came to America, for example, the Litvak tradition remained, and it was documented early in the 20th century. But after World War I, everything we have is coming from the South. It's a mixture of the core repertoire of Jews, of klezmer music from Ukraine, and this, say, mixture of Greek and Moldavian and Jewish. And already, let's say, in Kostakovsky's Hebrew Wedding Melodies from 1916, the largest number of genres are coming from this tradition. He himself was a Crimean klezmer. Moshe Baragovsky himself didn't know what to make of it. He was writing in Kiev and in Moscow, and he never researched it, didn't really understand what to do with it. He put in a few melodies of Honga and Bulgar and so forth. But in America, the irony is that Baragovsky hardly had access to this. If he had gone to New York, he would have found a lot of material to include. And the irony is that this tradition survived longer in New York than anywhere else. New York and Philadelphia, put it that way.
So,
Yeah.
speaking of which, I'm curious if you can go a little bit deeper about what happened in New York. Like you talked about how the Lansmanshaftn were the place that really were the hotbed for this music. Um, Before World War One, could you hear all these different styles in Lansmanshaftn in New York, and then it kind of centralized to this Moldovan style after World War One, or what were we hearing in New York in these
Well,
Lansmanshaftn?
we don't have documents, so I can't tell you. All we know is that the Litvak, the northern style, could preserve itself until after World War One. That we have some documents to show that. By the way, all the band leaders who were recorded after the First World War in America, they were all Southerners.
Mm.
They're either from Ukraine or from Galicia or from Romania proper. No Litvaks.
And
So,
so these Southerners, I mean, people like Naftuli Brandwein and Dave Tarras, um, how would you characterize the music that they recorded in New York? Um, how would you characterize that in relationship to the history of this tradition? Were things changing already in these recordings, or are these recordings a kind of faithful document of a tradition that really has its roots in Eastern Europe?
well, I would say that from what I knew Taras personally, of course, for years. Unfortunately, I never met Naftali Brandwein, although I know people that knew him. Um, the Jews were, put it this way, there were some things that were relevant and some things that were not relevant. And say Taras's son-in-law was a great jazz musician, and so the Musiker had an influence on Taras in that sense. But Taras always told me that actually this was for him, for the young man. It wasn't his music, And Greek music was much more relevant to Taras than any kind of jazz and so forth. But again, the core was this common understanding of the intonation expression of East European Jews expressed instrumentally. Because again, there's a big difference between the vocal traditions, the Yiddish song traditions, and the professional instrumental tradition. Um, let's say, hmm, uh, what happened in New York was creative. That the great musicians we know about, like Shlomo Beckerman, Naftali Brandwein, Dave Tarras, they were individuals. They did things. Each one had its own inspiration, actually, what they wanted to do. And in the case of Tarras, it's interesting. Although he was actually from Ukraine, not from Moldova, but his inspiration was coming from Moldova, and he was an extremely creative man. Naftali also took some of these elements. He interacted with Greek musicians. I know that he had Greeks playing with him. But again, it was a two-way street. I think Greeks were learning from the Jews, as I started at the very beginning, that the klezmer music had an effect on Greek Americans. They were big fans of klezmer music. Uh, so, and again, these were not musicologists. They were not distinguishing things by genres. But by genres, yes, for dancing, of course, but not so much with the origin of the tune. There was a sense of let's say, what their personal creativity would relate to, and also the mood at the time in New York. And there's a big difference in Naftali Brandwein and Dave Tarras. Naftali has a much more, what can I say, sad and kind of an exalted way of expressing himself. Tarras was much more optimistic, and that was also part of his appeal as a musician, I think.
It's fascinating, and these questions are so tough because they, they happen at the intersection of this historical, genres and practices that we're curious about, but then also, as you say, the creativity of these amazing individuals, and the changing times and other influences that are coming in. So it's hard to um, pick apart all of these different things, but it's fascinating to try. And I'm curious, apropos of that, if you could speak a little bit about the Klezmer Revival that happens in America following all these figures. What, how would you characterize that music in relationship to what came before it? What starts to change? You mentioned the term briefly at one point, neo-klezmer. So as you go into revival and into neo-klezmer and into our time today, what are
Mm.
things that are changing? How would you characterize this music and its relationship to the past?
Well, gee, I'm not perhaps not the person to ask. I'm too much in the middle of it. I just published an article for the Oxford Handbook of East European, Slavic and East European Folklore, where I wrote the chapter on klezmer music, and they specifically asked me to write about the revival. So I was forced to say a few words about the three phases of the revival, because again, they're very different. From the 70s and 80s is one thing, then the period of the 1990s is another, and then after the 90s, different things are happening. Also, remember, after the fall of communism, Europe got very involved in klezmer music. Germany became the most important center. And there are some very important musicians living in Germany. Some of them were Americans, some are Americans, some are not, some are Germans. And then partly through this fall of communism, you had Ukrainian and Russian Jewish musicians becoming involved. It's no longer an American story by any means. They're all interacting with each other. So I remember I was on a Zoom call the day before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we had members in Germany, in Ukraine, and in Moscow, all talking, all klezmer people, all talking together. So again, it's a very complicated story.
So if you had to give us a thumbnail, summary of those three phases, could you just briefly walk us through that?
Okay, well, gee. First, I mean, once we put Tarras on stage in '78, that was a big catalyst. That I mean, someone like Hank Kuznetsky could see that there was yet a reason to go back. It was his own tradition, but he could actually go back to it. And he's been teaching at the New England Conservatory. The Klezmatics were formed some years later. Andy Statman went off and did his own wonderful things with the Hasidic element as he became a Hasid. But one thing the important point is that in America, the music became only dance music. The wedding ritual music was lost already after the First World War. Jim Leffler did a wonderful master's thesis about this a long time ago, about because on this very simple level, the Jews could not afford. The first generations were working too hard. The conditions were very tough. They couldn't have a week-long wedding. And so all the non-dance music, all the listening music, the ritual melodies were forgotten. They were almost never recorded in America. Moshe Beregovsky documented them. And so, in fact, one of the things, I mean, when I was working with Andy and Tarras, we were very happy to play dance music. But even then, if you look at our first recording, Jewish klezmer music, we were taking things from written sources from Europe, not only from American sources. And then fast forward to the late 90s, after I spent a decade working with Turkish music, Ottoman music, I began to be, Itze Gottesman got me together with Yermia Hescheles, who was, the last European trained klezmer, who was a great Yiddish poet. I spent a year interviewing him. Then we formed with Stephen Greenman, we formed the group Chavrisa, and we made a point of working precisely not with this Moldavian music, and not only dance music, but trying to redevelop the listening music. Steve Greenman is actually one of the best composers of the wedding ritual style, one of the few that composes in that style. So again, in different phases, there were people trying to look at these various sources and look at the non-dance elements as well. But again, another thing I would say is that I hardly mentioned that Yiddish dance almost completely died out. And so in the last 20 years, I personally have made a point of teaching Yiddish dance and teaching Yiddish solo dance. And I have a few students, mostly in Europe, some in the States, some in Israel. But this was, again, once this dancing became very simplified or disappeared, much of the music that accompanied it was not relevant anymore. So anyway, that's not much of an answer, but it's the best I can do on one leg, so to speak.
That's great. Well, there's a lot more opportunity to keep reading all of your work that's out there, and perhaps some that are here today will join you for this class that you're teaching at the 92nd Street Y. A bunch of people are asking if there is a playlist associated with the book, or I'll extend that, if you have any listening suggestions for those that would like to delve into this music.
Well, actually, the book, my Klezmer book, Klezmer Music History and Memory, that has some sound attached. But this book, no, unfortunately, no. I could create such a thing, of course, and try
Yeah,
to
it could
respond
be
to
that
people.
could be a great project.
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, you reference so many recordings. So simply someone going through there and, creating a Spotify playlist of every recording you mentioned that is available, on Spotify or on another platform like that, that would be a tremendous resource for everyone. So there are many, many people watching right now. If anyone's curious to do that,
Wow.
I encourage you because there's a lot of wonderful stuff in there. And apropos of that, there are so many questions. So we're going to just get through as much as we can. My apologies if we don't
Okay.
get to your question out there. One person is asking about your father's Lansmanshaft, which you mentioned. Do you know how long that lasted? Is it still in existence, or when did it end its activities?
Oh, well, I don't actually. There are people who've worked on this more seriously. I mean, Itzik Gottesman, for example, is somewhat more knowledgeable about the Landsmannschaft situation. Weiser's book, he shares a name with you, I think, the Brotherhood of Memory,
Mm.
right? But that's from the 80s, so that's actually a while back. It's a subject. It's an important subject, of course.
I will say that as the Lansmanschaftn were closing, there were a few different phases of a lot of Lansmanschaftn closing. YIVO did a variety of projects to collect material
Uh-huh.
from these Lansmanschaftn, so we have a very extensive collection of Lansmanschaftn
That's great.
records at YIVO.
Cool.
Hundreds and hundreds of organizations. It's incredible stuff.
Well,
Um, Another viewer is asking, did the music of the Romaniot Jewish communities of Northwest Greece in Ioannina and
yeah, Ioannina.
Corfu um, carry these same musical traditions that you discussed today?
Absolutely not. No. But the Romanians are the indigenous Jews, who still spoke Greek. But the other curious point is that that region of northern Greece was part of the fur trade coming from Galicia, Moldova to Istanbul. And I've noted that the Christians, not the Jews, the Greeks, have some melodies which are definitely klezmer melodies. And I even discussed this with a professor in the University of Ioannina, who, by the way, had did a paper. He has a paper about Costa Gadinis, the first clarinetist we heard, who was from that region. And he also has a unpublished paper. Oh no, it's an unpublished paper about the Romanian discography of the Greeks. So and we discussed it. We met together at a conference in Bucharest in 2019, and we talked about this. That in fact there may well have been a connection of the fur trade and the music of the furriers going from
Hmm.
Galicia, Moldova to northern Greece into Istanbul, because there are some remarkable chassid sounding tunes played by the Christians up in that region. So, and that's never been researched. I mean, just after we met in Bucharest, the COVID broke out, and he said he had students who could research this, and then, we lost track of each other.
Hmm. It's amazing how much material there is in these rich traditions that is really unknown or waiting for someone to go champion it and go do this the legwork to try to put these things together.
Well, with oral tradition, one has to move fast.
Yeah.
I was in Moldova first in 2008, and I went to Abu Dhabi. There was funding for research, and I thought, well, what to do? And I realized Moldova was crucial because I met the only people who knew things were people over 70. And in fact, when I got back there in 2011, one of my informants has already passed away, another one had a stroke.
Mm.
So I knew if I didn't act fast, there'd be very little to find. And that's true of all these topics. Yeah.
So we're running out of time. I'm going to ask maybe two final questions. One
Sure.
is about dance. You mentioned that you have some private students. Are there any video sources or other ways that people can learn about
Oh,
Jewish dance traditions?
well, again, this was a moribund topic. And actually, thanks to Yiddish Summer Weimar, largely, I've been able to have students, mostly of East European Jewish background, coming from Ukraine, Moldova, Russia, Belarus, also in Israel. I was teaching at Beit Avichai, but unfortunately, I had some very good students there. One of my students, originally from Germany, she's from Belarus, Natalia Holava. She's a very good videographer, so she's put up quite a number of videos of my classes from Weimar. She even did a film called, during the COVID, she did a film in her shtetl in Belarus called Stay Home and Dance Chassidul,
Mm.
which shows her neighbors, Jewish and non-Jewish neighbors, dancing Chassid improvised melodies, dances that I taught her in Weimar. And
Wonderful.
she's now, yeah, so you look up, I can give you her name. You could look up her thing. She's now in Stockholm at the Paideia. And on YouTube, she has a number of, and also through Weimar, there are a number of videos of my students and me. And again, some of them are really excellent. And again, when teaching dancers from the Yiddish background from the former Soviet Union, I've taught also in Moscow 10 years ago, that there's a hidden knowledge that springs up, a bodily knowledge, that's there to be. Again, there's so much discouraged, but once you try to bring it out, it comes out very quickly.
And speaking of that, there's a few different questions about contemporary klezmer festivals. One person mentions Klezfest in Syracuse, New York. Another person mentions Klezmer Festival in Krakow. Um, do you have any comments you've talked about Weimar. Do you have any comments about this phenomenon of contemporary klezmer festivals, how it relates to all of this?
Well, actually, that's another subject because I know in the former Soviet Union, the klezmer festivals were enormously influential in reviving and redirecting the musicians there. And again, as with the dance, I found that with the Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish musicians, there was a hidden knowledge that came back very quickly, even in places where there were no longer living klezmer musicians. But somehow, once they set their minds to it, they understood things
Hmm.
in a way that others did not in the US or in Western Europe. I would say the preeminent klezmer festival is still Weimar, Yiddish Summer Weimar. Alan Byrne has put together, it goes on for a month now, and it has a wide variety of students and teachers from as far away as Japan and many places. I actually a study of the klezmer festivals is a work in itself.
Hmm.
I've never done that. Of course, Yiddish New York also has some, which I occasionally teach in. That also has some good people, of course. But I guess I don't know all the klezmer festivals, honestly. I haven't. I was in Krakow way back, but that's again a different phenomena. That has a different kind of function. It very much has to do with the Polish sort of revival or memorializing the Jews. But it's not. It's never. By the way, it's not a place where musicians learn. Say in Germany, there are many Germans who are studying klezmer music seriously. In Poland, that the phenomenon doesn't exist.
Well, Zev, there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm really grateful for this talk today and for your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I did my best. I wish I were more organized, but we try. Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Zev. And for all those that are out there, I encourage you to join us for the other events that we have in this series coming up. Jeremiah Lockwood speaking about cantoral music in America, Ron Raboy speaking about Yiddish theater music in America. In particular, Ron's going to be talking about Rimshinsky's run-ins with George Gershwin. And George, there was a question about Gershwin. Did Gershwin know this klezmer music? So if you're curious about Gershwin and Jewish music, you're going to want to check out this talk that Ron's going to be giving about Gershwin and Yiddish theater. And then the performance of this operetta, Chancha in America, with students from the Bard Vocal Arts Program at YIVO on May 18th. That's going to be a lot of fun. So everyone, please join us again. And Zev, thank you again for this wonderful talk.
I'd be happy to be in touch, by the way, with those who are interested in the discography for the book. Okay.
Okay, great. So if
find
anyone
somebody
has
to do that.
further questions, we will pass those on to Zev so that you can be in touch. And I encourage you to check out the book. It's available on YIVO's online bookstore. And it's a wonderful book. And as well as Zev's older books and some of the articles that he mentioned, there's a lot of, really important work that Zev's done in this field. And as we've discussed, so much more to do.
Well, actually, through the Klezmer Institute, by the way, you can find, if you look their website, a couple of the things I mentioned are there. The Klezmer Tunes for the Christian Bride is there, actually.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Klezmer Institute.
Okay, Klezmer Institute. I didn't realize they host, so they have a resource section on their website or
Yeah,
something.
they do.
Have
They
some
do.
PDFs there. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay, that's really good to know. Klezmer Institute, of course, is a wonderful project. That's a whole other story which we could go
Other
into,
story.
which one day we will do that. But yeah, so much to do, so little time. But as I said, Zev, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We're really grateful.
Cool. Okay. And thank you, Julia. Thank you, Alex.